The takeaway is brought to you by Progressive. Have you tried the Name Your Price tool yet? It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to find a rate that works for you. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive. Get your quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Hi, y'all. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and this is The Takeaway. Did you know in Salt Lake City you can go to jail for failing to return library books? In Tennessee, you can earn 6 years in prison and lose your voting rights for illegal camping. And until 2015, Alabama considered it a felony to teach a bear to wrestle. Come on, Bama, what are y'all doing? You teaching bears to wrestle? Listen, these are just some of the seemingly outrageous criminal penalties on the books in American cities and states. And when so much is against the law, well, anyone could find themselves suddenly facing charges. This is part of what civil rights attorney Dan Canon argues in his new book, Pleading Out: How Plea Bargaining Creates a Permanent Criminal Class. Now, Canon details how the speed and volume of our criminal legal system has led to a system where fewer than 3% of defendants are given a jury trial. Instead, more than 90% of criminal cases end with conviction as a direct result of plea bargaining. And this creates a permanent criminal class and undermines democracy. So I sat down with Dan Canon to discuss Pleading Out.
Plea bargaining is the primary means, and really almost the only means, by which we resolve criminal cases in the United States today. Right now, about 97% of all of our criminal cases are resolved by guilty pleas, which is way more than anywhere else in the world. And not coincidentally, we also have far worse criminal justice outcomes than the rest of the world by most metrics. We arrest more people for more things. We lock up more people for longer. The system is demonstrably racist and classist and all that. And the premise of my book is that we couldn't have gotten to this point without an unchecked, unregulated system of plea bargaining, which is prosecutors using whatever tools they can, any sort of carrot, any sort of stick, infinite time in jail, the death penalty, so on and so forth, to get people to plead as opposed to exercising their right to go to trial.
At the start of chapter 2, you write this sentence: "The American jury trial is dead." If I'm a listener, again, not necessarily involved in the system of criminal justice and criminal punishment, I would say, well, haven't I just been watching a bunch of jury trials on my court TV channel? What do you mean the American jury trial is dead?
Yeah, the jury trial has been getting chased into extinction over the last 200 years. So at this point, we're down to about 3% of all cases getting resolved via jury trial. And that number is actually dwindling. And, I think that part of the point of the book is that there's this potentially tremendous social value to having more people serve on juries that's just been lost due to the rise of plea bargaining. There's a bit in the book about the participation theory of democracy, the idea being that the more that you deliberate about some civic duty, the more you learn and care about the democracy that you're in. So, voting might make you care a little bit about your community and the stuff that you do for it. And jury service actually makes you care a lot. And if you accept that theory, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we should, the death of the jury trial is kind of like the death of democracy, or at least anything resembling an educated, engaged democracy. The integrated jury, for example, has barely been utilized at all in America. Women, for example, couldn't serve on juries in Massachusetts until 1950. And of course, people of color were systematically excluded from jury service long after that. And in some places still are. And by that time, by the 1950s and 1960s, the jury trial was already headed for extinction. It's practically extinct now. We've never really tried to use true juries of a defendant's peers to administer justice in this country.
And you, in this text, you try to trace out a historical and theoretical set of reasons why, right? Why we have never fully articulated or made a prolonged attempt to pursue justice in that way. And you write, the American legal system was designed by people in power as a tool to keep them in power at whatever cost. That's a pretty provocative claim there, that is the purpose and the design of the system itself. Walk us through at least a little bit to explain how you get to that claim.
Yeah, that's a lot for, I think, lay people and even most attorneys, even attorneys that work in the system every day, that believe they're doing justice on some level. It's a lot for us to accept that an institution itself, the courts themselves, could be classist or could be racist. I think for most people, it's not too hard to accept that the court system, the system of criminal justice that we inherited from the English way back when, was originally designed to be an explicitly classist system. And I think it's useful to ask, at what point in time did that change? To answer your question, plea bargaining started sometime around the 1830s, which is around the same time that the courts were actively and openly involved in trying to break the back of organized labor. So, you've got this nascent labor movement as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and prosecutors are using conspiracy statutes or what have you to prosecute workers for collective action, basically. By the 1830s, you've got this situation where the working classes are getting too big and too class conscious. And at the same time, you've got more working class people, white men, sitting on criminal juries. And those men were often quite sympathetic to workers who were being treated badly by their bosses. So it became too risky for the powers that were to just keep pounding away at the labor movement with criminal laws. They would have lost legitimacy. So the elites in New England still needed ways to break up working class solidarity. So they switched to a strategy of criminalizing all the behaviors of all the individual workers instead of trying to prosecute them as a group. So by prosecuting a critical mass of workers, you've got a situation in which the ruling classes could bring those workers under the control of the state to a degree. And also, and this is really important, attach the stigma of the criminal label to them, which helped to alienate so-called criminals from their communities and to disrupt working class solidarity. And the plea bargain was a way to do all that quickly and quietly. The jury trials were becoming too risky. And if you want to make thousands of criminals, you can't really do it with a jury trial. Trials take too long. So over time, more and more places in the country start buying into this system of quick deals. And prosecutors got more and more leeway to make those deals using whatever terms they wanted until you get to where we are today, which is, the jury trial is practically extinct. At the same time that you've got juries taken out of the equation, you've got this concerted effort by the courts to take powers away from the jury, make things more complicated for juries, put more power in the hands of the lawyers that are doing the wheeling and dealing. About the time that plea bargaining starts taking over, the criminal law in America starts to expand. So, as I said, rather than criminalizing organized labor outright, you've got a situation where all these individual behaviors that workers are engaging in get criminalized. And you've got this huge swelling of the criminal code, especially in the 20th century. When you hit prohibition in 1919, that's sort of a watershed moment, because then the federal government starts getting involved and criminalizing everything, and the states are following suit. So, behaviors that used to be considered fairly benign, and now all of a sudden the federal government, which was not really involved in too much day-to-day law enforcement before that time, starts getting heavily involved. And in fact, the number of people incarcerated in federal prisons tripled between 1920 and 1933. And so, by the time prohibition is over with, you've got this spoken sense of urgency driving criminal justice, because there's just so much crime out there. And, we got to take care of all that crime. And expediency becomes the guiding principle of the whole system. You got to lock up lots of people, and we got to do it fast. The year after prohibition goes away, you've got 9 different federal crime bills that pass easily and go into effect, criminalizing all kinds of stuff. And then with the rise of the administrative state, you've also got a whole host of different behaviors that don't even require criminal intent that you can lock people up for. I've got a story in the book about the Hennessyk case where you've got a contractor that hires a subcontractor that is in fact not even involved in the hiring of the subcontractor. The subcontractor, screws something up, backs a backhoe into something, and the contractor is prosecuted under the Clean Water Act and, ends up with 6 months in jail for something he really had no involvement in and couldn't even have had any intent. So there's a lot of that kind of thing now where you have these sort of zombie criminal laws that don't require intent, that aren't really a reflection of the mores of the community. And, then of course you've got the post-Jim Crow era where white America is addicted to locking up people of color. You've got the drug wars, you arrive at this place where just about, and this is where we are now, where just about anything you do can be considered criminal in some way. And one of the experts that I quoted in the book estimates that American professionals just sitting at a computer commit something like 3 felonies a week. So,
wow.
So during this time, all throughout the 20th century, plea bargaining is becoming more and more popular all over the country because you just can't prosecute all that crime if you're going to trial in every case. You got to have a quick fix, something that's going to streamline the process. And the end result is this total removal of the community from not just the courthouse, but the entire process of criminal justice, to where we don't really pay attention to the new criminal laws that come down. It's like, okay, yeah, whatever, it's a new criminal law. I talked to some state legislators in the book, who admit to not having read the criminal bills that come in front of them, and they still vote for it because it's like, okay, well, this is a new criminal law, and we like that, and this is going to pass pretty easily, and I don't want to be on the wrong side of it. And that's where we are. We're the community is totally divorced from criminal justice, which is sort of an unprecedented thing in human history to have happen.
2 things I want to get you to walk through. One, as you're talking about that moment that shifts around sort of white America becoming addicted to locking up non-white folks, particularly African Americans, Latinos, and you kind of walk us through sort of the shift in prison population rates. But I will say, you don't talk much or write much about race in the book. There are a few moments you certainly designate it, you clarify it, but this is, as you're writing about the notion of criminal class and criminal identity, and again, centering around unions and around prohibition, I have to say, I felt a little like it felt insufficient to me, or it felt like, is he trying not to talk about race? Is he encouraging, because sort of your point about like just working on your computer, you may have committed 4 felonies. I was wondering if this was explicit and purposeful, in part to have more Americans have a sense of their own vulnerability within this system, or if for you it is more of a class and almost caste framework than a race one. I was genuinely interested in how you did or did not manage race within the text.
So, and all fair questions, and I'm glad you asked me that. I mean, the issues of race and class in the United States are inextricably bound. There's just no question about that. And we've got certain, kinds of classism that have just, if the whole creation of race was sort of the same sort of strategy that I talk about in the book, where you're trying to pit working class people against each other. And in many ways, the criminal class is seen as, synonymous with people of color. And that's where we've gotten to in this country. I don't write much about that. I do cover it. I don't write much about that in the book. Not because I want the book to be totally reductionist and only talking about class, but mostly because there are other scholars of race in the criminal law that do it so much better. And I wanted to take a broader lens and to look, at the problem focused on class, not because race doesn't matter to the conversation, because of course it does, but simply because it's a different way of understanding it. And, so if you look at books like The New Jim Crow, for example, they handle the racial aspect of this whole problem, I think, much better than I could.
Dan Canon, author of Pleading Out, How Plea Bargaining Creates a Permanent Criminal Class. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This week on The Experiment, Atlantic editor Dan Engber has spent months with rehab engineer James Sulzer.
I went into this to build devices to help people, but I never considered that building devices might not be the answer.
Now he tinkers away, trying to help his daughter Livy regain brain function.
It's really easy as a scientist to poo-poo everything and be skeptical. But as a parent, you need to have some optimism and you need to have leaps of faith.
Listen to The Experiment wherever you get podcasts.